pot of herbal tea for this one, because I'm going to get all esoteric on your way. So this video springs from a conversation I was having in a pub the other night, and a waitress walked by and she came over and said, as a joke to me, "You're far too brainy for this shithole, you'll have to leave." And so it was a bit of crack, but it was a kind of a universal insight that actually validated the conversation that I was having with my friend. I was listening to John Waters and Christian Morris on that another 3.5 hour Odyssey on Odyssey and Epic. And one point Christian said to John Waters, I think the discussion was in relation to termination of pregnancy, where he said, well, as a pagan, I don't believe there's such a thing as an objective evil. And then went on to reiterate, there is evil, but I don't believe it's objective. Now, people may say, well, that doesn't make any sense. Well, it does actually, and it's important that the distinction of how that makes sense is understood, because it'll actually make all our lives better. Now, the assumption that something is evil, right? Now let's talk about, I think if you were to define evil, I think Aleister Crowley's description of black magic is probably the best description of what evil is. That any act of magic that doesn't involve the advancement of the self, of the soul, of you as a person, is an act of black magic. And by that he meant, and I think Gardner explained it even a bit more, that if you try to impose your will upon another person, get them to do something against their will, or trick them into doing it, or getting them drunk or drugging them up and getting them to do it, that's evil. So we see that on the world all the time. So coercion could be considered a form of evil. You're coerced into something. So we've seen that on the last 2 years regarding the transubstantiation of the sacred, you know what? And so that's evil. So when you try to impose your will upon someone else without their acquiescence, that's a form of evil. Now, then there's the concept of philosophical or theological evil. So something that your religion or your personal philosophy or your own inclinations in life deems evil, it's only philosophically evil from your, or theologically, or even moralistically. This is why I don't believe in morals. I believe in decency, because morality is a product of theory, where decency is a product of natural law. You can take that one to the bank. So, for example, if you deem someone evil because they went against a tenet of your religious belief, well, that's a semantic evil. It's not an evil of actual an act of evil. They've done something that you find offensive according to you, your religion, according to whatever you believe in. So, for instance, if I burn a book of a certain holy religion, and it's only evil to members of that religion, to me it's just a piece of paper. So you see what I'm saying? It's like that. It's a semantic kind of evil. It's a moralistic theological issue rather than an actual thing. Who was harmed directly by the burning of that book, that holy book? Absolutely no one. No one at all. So therefore, it's not evil. It's a viewpoint, it's objective viewpoint, and it's based on a relative notion. It's not based on anything that you could actually say damaged another person. And taking that one step further, you could say, well, you could do it to damage another person if you deliberately did it to hurt someone. Yeah, that's definitely true. Okay, but the initial so if you got someone who had deep faith, and say was mourning the loss of their loved one, and you said, "There's no such thing as God," and look, I'll prove it to you. I'll burn this holy book, this Saint King James Bible, and nothing will happen to me. And you did that just to upset that person who needed that faith at their moment of crisis. You've done you've done a wicked evil thing, of course, yeah. So it always depends upon the intent, upon the initial spark of intention at the outset regarding the act, okay? But there's also a beautiful evil. Now, you're going to find this really weird, especially you Abrahamics, but you're learning. You're being enlightened. Ooh, okay? Inside all of us, regardless of what religious or spiritual path you take, or not, there is a constant battle between opposing sides of our conscious thoughts. And everything is a conscious decision in one way or another. And we have to decide constantly on this. If you make your conscious decisions based upon what would Jesus do or what would Mohammed, well, I don't always say that. That's not fair, because I actually think what would Jesus do is actually kind of a good thing. What would Yahweh think? What would Allah think? What would Buddha think? What would Shiva think? What would any deity, Zoroaster, what would they think of me for doing this? That's an NPC behavior, because you're not doing it because there's a discussion taking place within inside yourself. You're doing it entirely because of your religious beliefs, and your religious beliefs are canons of behaviors and rules sent down to you, and if you follow them, you're a good member of the flock, literally, and if you don't, you're a bad member of the flock. So you're confronted with a situation where you say, what would the Lord, how will the Lord judge me in terms of how I handle this situation? You're an NPC. You're not thinking, okay? You're handing over one of the most beautiful gifts that the natural world has given you, your internal dialogue, to an arbitrary set of rules that were almost certainly done to control people like you in the past. Now, let's talk about Christians, and this is where I was talking about the pub that got me into trouble. When Christians say, "What would Jesus do?" I think that's actually a very positive statement. And it's really what you're saying is, what would my conscience do? What would my conscience? What should my conscience? What will my conscience do? And it's very difficult to make a decision instantaneously unless you're a dogmatic following NPC of a religion or a faith. Otherwise, you then enter into a dialogue, and this is shown all through spiritual traditions. The most famous being the two most. I'll give you the two most famous, and then I'll give you kind of a modern mythological version. The most famous in theology is the Jesus in the desert, and the darkest night of soul, being confronted by the devil. Now, I say the devil because within certain Hebrew texts, you wouldn't have Jesus mentioned anyway, and within the Christian text, they either mention, in the King James versions, Lucifer, which we know is a mistranslation of of a Hebrew term. It's not actually Lucifer. And in other like Catholic texts they use Satan, which just means the opposer. You see, now we're into a whole other field. Was the opposer a literal demonic being, a literal devil in the desert tempting Jesus, or was it Jesus' other part of his human consciousness, the other side of him, entering into this classic debate with his own conscience? Now, there's the rub, okay? There is the rub, okay? So that's why I'm calling him the devil, which just means, it's just a French word for of evil, okay? So, but it's not really a good thing, but we'll just say, just for the sake of understanding, okay? I'm not going to use Satan, that's Shaitan, which means the opposer, which is actually a great term, but I'm not going to use that because it comes loaded. I'm not going to use Lucifer because it's incorrect in terms of Christian theology. Completely incorrect. So, Jesus is in the desert. He's having a dark night of the soul. And I believe in the passage, the devil says to Jesus, all of this, he shows him all of Israel and all of the Middle East and the whole world, says, all this could be yours if you turn your back on your father. Meaning that he has to go back into Jerusalem to basically be sacrificed, to be crucified in the Christian tenet. And he says, get thee behind me, Satan. Now that's a very simple description of this internal dialogue between opposing states of consciousness regarding the engagement with a situation. But it's still a good one. It's a Christian one, it's the most simple one, but that's probably why it's been most successful. It's when I was in school, I probably would have enjoyed theology class much better if they had to explain to us that the devil wasn't actually a fellow with horns mocking Jesus' potential sacrifice, but was actually an internal part, the Lucifer, the internal esoteric Lucifer, the light within, shining inside Jesus, saying, you have a choice to walk away. What are you going to do? Now, the other great theological example of that is in the Bhagavad Gita. You have the legendary discussion between Arjuna and Krishna at the field of Purvashta, where Arjuna, you have the despondency of Arjuna. He looks over the opposing battlefield and sees that the opposing army is made up of his cousins, relatives, and friends. There's just the classic civil war situation. They've fallen on the other side, brother against brother. This is why in most countries that have had civil wars, the civil wars in those countries have left a profound spiritual experience. In fact, the RTA, Ireland's national TV station, covered something that my great-grandmother told me about, that during the War of Independence and the Civil War of Ireland, there was endless paranormal and Fortean, especially during the Civil War, strange experiences that happened, very heavily reported, and to the point where the national TV station did a special on them. And the same with the American Civil War, the battlefields of Gettysburg, because these civil wars where you have brother against brother, sister against sister, they create a powerful spiritual echo, both at the time and into the future. And that's a big deal. And even in England, although it's a long time ago now and it's greatly forgotten, but the English Civil War, you have a lot of the witchcraft trials and stuff came out of that, but you also had a lot of things like the levelers, and the levelers created the first ever working constitution to give rights to the working class and so on. And that left a deep, and there's lots of, if you go to all the battlefields in England that have ghosts and hauntings, they're nearly all Civil War battlefields. I digress, but you see where I'm going with this. So, in the field of Purvashta, Arjuna and Krishna are having this dialogue, and it becomes one of the greatest. It's very similar to Jesus and the devil in the desert, but it's much more complex and much more expansive. But ultimately, it's the same thing. It's Arjuna's consciousness talking with himself. It's deeply inspiring. Well, for me, anyway, it has been. And in a pop culture sense, you can expand this to everything. So I was explaining to my friend, you look at Lord of the Rings, right? And I said, if you look at the Fellowship, you have Aragorn, who represents a Christ-like figure within Frodo's consciousness, and you have Boromir, who represents a Luciferian consciousness within inside Frodo. Both are battling it out. Aragorn represents the struggle of sacrifice that's needed under no matter what, the internal fortitude, the inner strength that carry that ring all the way to Mount Doom, to hell and back, literally. Tolkien, we know, was a deeply devout Catholic, but he was also someone who understood theology and mythology very well from an archetypal level, as did Jung, as did Joseph Campbell. Now, my two other heroes. So, where Boromir represents the Luciferian insight, someone who says, why am I sacrificing? This is the internal insight that we're going on in the internal part of Frodo. Why bother going to hell and back to Mount Doom with this ring? If I have this ring, I could control the world. I could be the most powerful being on the planet. And this is the despondency of Boromir all through the Fellowship. He's torn asunder by, why can't we use this ring to defeat Sauron? But it's driven by his own insecurities. Aragorn is an actual king of is the actual king of Gondor. Okay, he has entered into the desert for his 40 days a night, metaphorically as the ranger strider, but he's now returned, as Elrond said, to cast off the ranger and become the king you are meant to be. Boromir, who is a man of great honor, is ravaged by the insecurities because he's the son of the steward of Gondor. So therefore, just a temporary fixture, a temporary, what's the word, position that will be ultimately handed over, my friend Michael there, ultimately handed over to Aragorn. So therefore, Boromir becomes something much deeper in the story of the Fellowship of the Rings than an insecure, and he's a great hero of Gondor. He's a great warrior. He's his father's favorite, and he has no reason to be shattered. In fact, Faramir should be the one, and that's why Faramir didn't go. That's why Faramir would have been even more vulnerable, because of how his father treated him. That was Boromir's brother. So Faramir is a very interesting character within the Lord of the Rings. So Boromir goes instead and becomes the what if Luciferian light from inside the consciousness of Frodo, shining towards Aragorn, saying, why are we going through this absolute hell when all we could do is take the ring and perhaps defeat Sauron in this manner? And of course, we all know that the ring is a poison chalice, and no man could ever have the power of a god. And that's ultimately what the ring provides. The ring provides a god force where Sauron's psychopathic, Jehovic-type nature could easily wield the power of the ring without destroying him, even because he created it, where Faramir and Aragorn couldn't do that, and certainly Frodo couldn't do it. And that's why Frodo takes, after Boromir almost steals the ring off Frodo decides that he must carry this burden alone. That he cannot, and this what Frodo is really saying is, not so much that I physically can't have Aragorn and Boromir around me, I can't have Aragorn and Boromir inside me. And so he sets off initially, before Sam follows him, on his quest towards Mount Doom. So he has that classic opposing Shaitan opposing dialogue with inside him, okay, that has him coming to terms with the fact that he has to embark on his own hero's journey by himself and carry this burden within inside himself. And being the smallest member of the fellowship, carrying this burden inside the smallest person. And so this is a way of talking and telling us that even the smallest of us, the most little of us, will carry the burdens of the world inside us. And rather than, say, being an NPC and saying, I do this because I'm a conservative, I do this because I'm a liberal, I do this because I'm Christian, I do this because I'm a Muslim, I do this because I'm an atheist, you're not fulfilling that potential conflict inside you. Whereas you indulge both sides of the argument. And this is why I brought this Luciferian thing. Okay, it's the pagan Luciferian thing that I brought into my life. But I've also got a great acknowledgement, I wouldn't say affinity, what's the word? Appreciation for how the esoteric Luciferians bring this Luciferian concept into themselves. Because ultimately it creates a healthier psychic balance within the individual. So therefore you'd have like a Christian having terrible thoughts about someone who tried to destroy them, and they're like a bit torn apart by it. Where a pagan would say, I don't care, he's an evil person, he did a horrible thing to me, I don't care if he lives or dies, fuck him. I'm not praying for his soul, I'm not turning the other cheek. I'm not, I'm not loving thy brother. See, this is what makes the pagan's perfectly happy with hating their enemy. But they have to, it's seen within paganism and within things like Levay Satanism, it's seen, and it is much more healthy to burn that hatred out of you rather than to bottle it inside you. Go, the Lord said I must love my enemies, and you're torn to bits by it. The sooner that rage will burn out inside you, and then you'll be apathetic. You know, they say when someone hurts you and you hate them, you still love them. What's the opposite of love and hate? The opposite of love is hate, and hate and love are the same thing. That's what they are. The opposite of love is apathy. And apathy only comes about by burning the hatred out of yourself. And how do you burn the hatred out of yourself? You pick up that sword and you indulge the hatred. I don't mean you have to attack the person or anything, but you say, that bastard did me wrong. And you burn that hatred out of yourself. But if you do something like, the Lord wants me to forgive them and love them, you will be torn asunder on the inside. And that psychic volcano, that Mount Doom within you, will actually blow up and consume you. And that's the purpose of this internal dialogue, where eventually you'll find that someone who buries goes, the Lord wants me to indulge them and sorry, forgive them and love thy brother. You will find that those people do not attain resolution of the issue at hand. It'll always be bothering them deep down inside. Whereas someone who says, because you have to go into a catatonic state just to deal with that, where someone who says, fuck, I'm bad, I hate the bad, it's gone, it's burnt out. And then you reach a Zen-like state. You find a balance. You find the equilibrium between Aragorn and Boromir, Jesus and Lucifer, Arjuna and Krishna inside you. And that's so important. So always remember that. When you want to think of something being evil or not, think in terms of why you think it's evil. And if it's genuine evil in terms of a vicious trespass against you, you have to then indulge in that battle inside you. And hatred is okay once you burn it out eventually. There's nothing worse than people who... This is why families are so often torn asunder, because there's things like there's a long-standing grievance, say, a daughter has with her father, or a brother has with another brother. And for the sake of the family, they hold it all together. But it creates an incredibly tense situation This is why you, you you will never meet a warrior who's full of hatred and torment. This is the whole concept of the Zen-like warrior. The sword in one hand, and the hand, I mean, I think Bruce Springsteen of all people, he made a speech once. I saw him say, and he described the Irish and the Italians, and he says the Irish and the Italians are very similar in that they walk into a room with one arm to hug you, and arm behind your back in case they have to fight you. And I think that's actually a quite a good way to look at life. You don't have. This is why you were born and manifested into his existence, to have this attainment of wisdom through indulging polar opposites and polar states, and you will find your life is infinitely better because of that. It can it, dogma dogma is not your friend. That's when, I mean, one of the things I had a problem. I remember what's his name. Terence McKenna once made a statement to a bunch of Americans saying, "Culture is not your friend." I disagree with that completely. Culture is not your friend when you follow for no reason, and it also depends on the culture. Okay, dogma is really not your friend. Culture is actually what's going to save us from this monster world coming down. Individual tribes. Dogma is not your friend, and that's also secular dogma. Take care, love yous all.